July 1969. The whole world was watching Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong was taking his first step on the moon. America had won. But nobody knew that just 15 days earlier, the Soviets had launched their own moon rocket, the N-1, the most powerful rocket in history. 30 engines, 105 meters tall, the last chance to beat the Americans. The rocket lifted off from the launch pad. For 12 seconds, everything was going well. Then the world exploded. The N-1 detonated with the force of 7 kilotons, half the power of the Hiroshima bomb. The launch pad was completely destroyed. The explosion was visible from 40 kilometers away, and the Soviets hid it from the world for 30 years. But the Americans were watching. Spy satellites recorded everything. The CIA calculated the size of the explosion, and they laughed, because the Soviet moon dream had turned into a fireball. This is the story of the greatest rocket disaster in history, and how an empire tried to erase it from existence. To understand the N-1 disaster, you must first understand the stakes. In 1961, President Kennedy made a bold promise. America would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. It was an audacious goal. America had barely put a man in orbit. The technology to reach the moon did not exist. But Kennedy understood something important. The space race was not about science. It was about prestige. Whoever reached the moon first would prove the superiority of their system. Capitalism or communism, freedom or control. The moon was the ultimate prize. The Soviets had dominated the early space race. Sputnik, Laika, Gagarin. Every milestone belonged to them. American prestige was bleeding. Something dramatic was needed to turn the tide. The moon landing would be that something. The Soviets watched Kennedy's speech with alarm. They had planned to continue their methodical approach to space exploration. Orbital stations, unmanned probes, gradual progress. But Kennedy had changed the rules. Now there was a deadline. Now there was a race. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, faced a choice. He could ignore Kennedy's challenge and risk looking weak. Or he could accept it and commit the Soviet Union to a crash program that might bankrupt the country. He chose to race. In 1964, the Soviet government officially approved the N-1 program. The goal was simple: beat the Americans to the moon, whatever it took. The man tasked with building the N-1 was Sergei Korolev. He was the greatest rocket engineer of the 20th century, and almost nobody knew his name. The Soviet government kept Korolev's identity secret. He was referred to only as the chief designer. His face was never shown. His achievements were credited to the collective genius of Soviet science. Individual glory was not permitted. But within the space program, Korolev was a god. He had designed the R-7, the rocket that launched Sputnik and Gagarin. He had pushed Soviet space technology further than anyone thought possible. When he spoke, engineers listened. Korolev's vision for the N-1 was ambitious. The rocket would be larger than anything ever built. It would carry a payload capable of landing 2 cosmonauts on the moon. It would restore Soviet prestige and prove communist superiority. But Korolev faced a critical problem. The Soviet Union did not have engines powerful enough for the task. The American Saturn V used 5 F-1 engines in its first stage. Each F-1 produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. They were engineering marvels, the most powerful rocket engines ever built. The Soviets had nothing comparable. Their best engine produced only 1/10 the thrust of an F-1. To match Saturn V's power, Korolev would need many engines. Many engines. The decision was made. The N-1's first stage would use 30 NK-15 engines arranged in 2 rings. 30 engines that all had to ignite simultaneously. 30 engines that all had to work in perfect harmony. 30 points of potential failure. American engineers who later learned of this design were horrified. It was an invitation to disaster. If you want to discover the secret technologies and untold stories of the Cold War, subscribe to our channel. We bring you new content every week. On January 14, 1966, Sergei Korolev went into the hospital for routine surgery. He had been suffering from intestinal problems for years. The procedure was supposed to be simple. He never came out. Korolev died on the operating table. He was 59 years old. The cause was complications from surgery, exacerbated by years of poor health. His body had been broken by his time in Stalin's Gulag, where he had spent 6 years as a political prisoner. The Soviet space program was devastated. Korolev had been more than a chief designer. He had been a unifying force, a leader who could resolve disputes and keep competing factions focused on the goal. Without him, the program began to fracture. His successor was Vasily Mishin. Mishin was a competent engineer but lacked Korolev's political skills and personal authority. He could not control the rival design bureaus. He could not secure the resources the N1 needed. He could not hold the program together. The N1 project descended into chaos. Different engineering groups pursued different solutions. Resources were scattered across competing programs. Testing was rushed to meet impossible deadlines. Quality control deteriorated. The Americans, by contrast, had a clear chain of command. Wernher von Braun led the Saturn V program with absolute authority. Every decision flowed through him. Every resource was focused on a single goal. The Soviets were fighting each other. The Americans were fighting physics. Physics was easier to defeat. February 21, 1969. 5 months before Apollo 11, the first N1 rocket stood on the launch pad at Baikonur. It was an impressive sight. 105 meters tall, weighing nearly 3,000 tons when fully fueled, the largest rocket ever built. If it worked, it would carry a Soviet crew to the moon. At 12:27 local time, the 30 engines of the first stage ignited. The N1 rose slowly from the pad, climbing on a pillar of fire. For 68 seconds, everything seemed to work. The rocket climbed through the atmosphere, accelerating toward space. Then, at an altitude of 12 kilometers, something went wrong. A fire broke out in the engine compartment. The automated safety system detected the problem and shut down all 30 engines. Without thrust, the N1 began to fall. The range safety officer sent the destruct command. The rocket exploded in mid-air, scattering debris across the Kazakh steppe. The first N1 test had failed, but failures were expected in rocket development. The engineers examined the data, made corrections, and prepared for the next attempt. They had no idea how bad things would get. July 3, 1969. 15 days before Apollo 11 would land on the moon, the second N1 stood on the pad. The Soviets were desperate. This was their last chance to beat the Americans. If this launch succeeded, they could still claim victory. If it failed, the race was lost. At 11:18 local time, the engines ignited. The N1 began to rise. It got 12 seconds into the flight. One of the 30 engines exploded. Debris was sucked into the other engines. One by one, they failed. The automated system tried to compensate, but could not overcome the cascade of failures. The rocket reached an altitude of approximately 200 meters. Then it began to fall back toward the launch pad. The N1 was fully fueled. Nearly 2,300 tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen. When it hit the ground, the result was the largest artificial non-nuclear explosion in history. The blast was equivalent to 7 kilotons of TNT. For comparison, the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. The N1 explosion was half a nuclear weapon. The launch complex was completely destroyed. The pad, the service tower, the support buildings, everything within a half-kilometer radius was obliterated. The fireball rose kilometers into the sky. The shock wave was felt tens of kilometers away. Miraculously, no one was killed. The launch crews had been in protected bunkers, but the physical destruction was total. And above the smoking ruins, American spy satellites were watching. They photographed the devastated launch site. They calculated the size of the explosion, and they reported to Washington that the Soviet moon program had just suffered a catastrophic setback. The Soviets would never recover. The Soviets did not give up. They rebuilt the launch pad. They modified the engines. They tried again. June 27, 1971. The third N-1 launch. This time, the rocket performed better. It cleared the launch pad. It climbed through the first stage burn. But at 51 seconds into the flight, the rocket began to rotate uncontrollably. The problem was unexpected. The 30 engines created complex aerodynamic forces that the control system could not handle. The rocket began to spin. The structural loads exceeded design limits. The N-1 tore itself apart. Once again, debris rained down on the Kazakh steppe. Once again, the engineers went back to the drawing board. November 23, 1972. The fourth and final N-1 launch. This was the most successful flight yet. The first stage burned for 107 seconds, nearly completing its mission. The rocket reached an altitude of 40 kilometers. Then, just 6 seconds before first stage separation, the engines exploded. The cause was later identified as a hydraulic failure that led to an engine shutdown. The resulting imbalance caused the remaining engines to fail catastrophically. The rocket disintegrated. 4 launches, 4 failures, billions of rubles, years of work. All of it turned to ash and twisted metal. On the plains of Kazakhstan. After the fourth failure, the N-1 program continued on paper for a few more years, but everyone knew it was over. In 1976, the program was officially canceled. The remaining N-1 rockets were dismantled, the tooling was destroyed, and the Soviet government pretended none of it had ever happened. The N-1 program was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in Soviet history. It employed tens of thousands of workers. It consumed billions of rubles. It represented the pride of an empire. And the Soviet government erased it from history. No announcement was made when the program was canceled. No explanation was offered for the failed launches. Official history simply did not mention the N-1. When asked about their moon program, Soviet officials claimed that the USSR had never intended to land humans on the moon. "We were always focused on space stations," they said. "Lunar landing was an American obsession. We chose a wiser path." It was a breathtaking lie. Thousands of people had worked on the N-1. Entire cities had been built to support the program. The explosions had been visible for kilometers. Yet the Soviet state simply declared that none of it existed. Western intelligence knew the truth. Spy satellites had photographed the launch failures. CIA analysts had tracked the program's progress for years. But without Soviet acknowledgement, the full story remained hidden. The cover-up held for decades. Soviet citizens who had worked on the N-1 were forbidden to discuss it. Documents were classified or destroyed. The wreckage of the failed rockets was hauled away and scrapped. It was not until the Soviet Union collapsed that the truth emerged. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Glasnost opened the archives. Engineers who had worked on the N-1 finally told their stories. Photographs of the massive rocket were published for the first time. The world learned that the space race had been much closer than anyone knew. The Soviets had come within months of potentially beating America to the moon. Only technical failures and terrible luck had stopped them. The N-1's failure was not caused by any single problem. It was the result of systemic failures at every level. The 30-engine design was fundamentally flawed. The American F-1 engines were extensively tested before flight. Each engine was fired multiple times on test stands. Problems were identified and corrected before the rocket ever left the ground. The Soviet NK-15 engines were never tested as a complete cluster. There was no facility capable of test-firing 30 engines simultaneously. The first time all 30 engines fired together was during an actual launch attempt. Every flight was, in effect, a test. The lack of testing was driven by politics and budget constraints. Building a test facility for 30 engines would have cost billions and taken years. The Soviet leadership wanted results now. They gambled that the engines would work without full testing. They lost. The management structure was equally dysfunctional. After Korolev's death, no one had clear authority over the program. Different design bureaus competed for resources and credit. Decisions were made by committee, with predictable inefficiency. The rivalry between Korolev's bureau and Vladimir Chelomey's competing design group was particularly destructive. Chelomey had his own lunar program, which siphoned resources away from the N1. Political infighting consumed energy that should have gone into engineering. The Americans faced their own challenges. The Apollo program suffered a devastating fire that killed 3 astronauts. There were technical setbacks and budget battles, but the American program had clear leadership, adequate testing, and a focused organizational structure. The Soviets had brilliant engineers, working with inadequate resources under impossible deadlines in a dysfunctional organization. The N1 was doomed before it ever left the pad. History is full of what-ifs. The N1 provides one of the most tantalizing. What if Korolev had lived? He was only 59 when he died. With better medical care, he might have survived another decade or more. Would his leadership have made the difference? What if the Soviets had built proper test facilities? The cost would have been enormous, but so was the cost of 4 failed launches. Testing might have revealed the problems that destroyed the rockets. What if the political infighting had been controlled? A unified Soviet space program focused on a single goal might have matched the American effort. The answer to all these questions is probably not. The fundamental problem was the engine design. The Soviets could not build an F-1 equivalent. Their industrial base could not produce large rocket engines with the required reliability. The 30-engine solution was an attempt to compensate for this weakness. But 30 engines meant 30 times as many potential failure points. No amount of testing could reduce this risk to acceptable levels. The design was inherently fragile. Even if the N1 had worked, the Soviet lunar module was behind schedule. The spacesuits were not ready. The training program was incomplete. A successful N1 launch in 1969 would not have put Soviets on the moon before Armstrong. The race was closer than the public knew, but it was probably never as close as the Soviets hoped. The N1 program left a complicated legacy. The rocket itself was a dead end. The technology was abandoned. No part of the N1 design was used in later Soviet rockets. It was a massive investment that produced nothing of lasting value. But the experience gained was not entirely wasted. Many engineers who worked on the N1 went on to design the Energia rocket, which launched the Buran space shuttle in the 1980s. Lessons learned from the N1's failures informed later designs. The cover-up had its own legacy. The Soviet habit of hiding failures created a culture of secrecy that persisted long after it served any purpose. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded in 1986, the initial instinct was to cover it up, just as the N1 failures had been hidden. The culture of denial had become institutional. For American observers, the N1 failure validated their approach. The Saturn V, with its 5 thoroughly tested engines, flew 13 times without a single failure. The careful, methodical approach had proven superior to the Soviet crash program. Today, the N1 is remembered as a symbol of Soviet overreach, an empire that tried to match American achievements without American resources, a system that valued propaganda over engineering, a dream that exploded on the launch pad. But it is also remembered with a certain respect. The engineers who designed the N1 were among the best in the world. They were given an impossible task and nearly accomplished it. They pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. The N1 failed, but it failed while reaching for the moon. There are worse epitaphs.